Imagine you are trapped in a metal coffin called a submarine. Hundreds of feet deep in the ocean, the temperature inside your submarine has exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. You haven't seen sunlight for weeks. Almost all your communication with the outside world is cut off. You don't know if a war has broken out between your country and the enemy above. At this very moment, a series of explosions begins right above your submarine. Each sound hits the metal walls like someone is relentlessly pounding your coffin with a giant hammer. Your captain is trembling with anger, fear, and agitation. He screams, "The war has started! They want to sink us. We will destroy them." In front of you is a button. Pressing that button will launch a torpedo with a force nearly equal to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It will instantly vaporize the enemy fleet surrounding your submarine. And simultaneously, it will start World War III, a nuclear war that will ultimately destroy human civilization. Meanwhile, your captain and another senior officer are both ready to launch the torpedo. Only your yes is needed. The fate of the world depends on your single word. What would you do? This incredible story is not the plot of a science fiction movie. It is a real event from one of the most terrifying days in history. And the man whose one no saved human civilization from certain destruction was named Vasili Arkhipov. This is his story. This is the story of the forgotten hero to whom we are all indebted. To understand the context of this story, we must go back to October 1962. The Cold War was at its peak. On one side was the capitalist world led by the United States, and on the other, the socialist world led by the Soviet Union. Both sides viewed each other with suspicion, and both possessed thousands of nuclear bombs, enough to destroy the entire world several times over. A few events added fuel to this tension. First, America deployed nuclear missiles named Jupiter in Turkey and Italy, which could directly strike Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. In response, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made a terrifying move. He decided to secretly deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. Cuba is only 90 miles from the American coast. Therefore, missiles launched from there could destroy major American cities, including Washington, D.C., in just a few minutes. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured photographs of these secret missile installations. When the photos reached President John F. Kennedy's desk, it was as if a thunderbolt had struck the White House. Nuclear weapons at America's doorstep, it was something no one could have imagined. For the next 13 days, the entire world held its breath in fear of a nuclear war, a period known in history as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy's military advisors were urging him to launch direct airstrikes and a military invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy knew that such an act would provoke a Soviet retaliation, triggering a horrifying war. He chose a middle path. On October 22nd, he announced that the US Navy would establish a naval quarantine around Cuba. This meant that any Soviet ship heading to Cuba suspected of carrying weapons would be stopped and searched or turned back. This announcement was a direct challenge to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev called it an act of piracy. Soviet ships continued to advance toward Cuba, while American warships stood in their way. The world had never been so directly on the verge of a nuclear war. In schools and colleges, students were being drilled on how to take cover under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. People were buying essential supplies and preparing to take shelter in bunkers. Everyone had the same question on their minds. Will we see tomorrow's sun? But the real drama was unfolding out of sight, deep in the Atlantic Ocean. While the world was worried about the missiles in the sky, Khrushchev had played another of his trump cards. He had secretly sent a flotilla of 4 diesel-electric attack submarines toward Cuba. The mission of these submarines was to establish a Soviet naval base in Cuba and help break the US naval quarantine. Each of these 4 submarines carried a special weapon. This special weapon was a T-5 nuclear torpedo with an explosive yield of 15 kilotons, nearly the same as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The commanders of these submarines were instructed that if they were attacked and could not contact Moscow, they could make their own decisions. They were authorized to use this weapon if they chose. Our story centers on one of the submarines in this flotilla, the B-59. These submarines were built for the ice-cold waters of the Barents Sea, but this mission was in the warm waters of the Caribbean. As a result, the air conditioning systems inside the submarines failed. The temperature rose to unbearable levels, sometimes reaching 60 degrees Celsius. The crew members were suffering from dehydration. They received only 1 glass of water per day. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and carbon dioxide. The biggest problem was communication. Once submerged, direct contact with Moscow was nearly impossible. The US Navy had surrounded them, preventing them from surfacing to communicate by radio. They were completely isolated, alone, and exhausted. They didn't know if a war had already started above, or if there was still room for negotiation. The day was October 27th, 1962. In history, this day is called Black Saturday. On this day, the crisis reached its peak. That morning, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet missile. The pilot, Rudolf Anderson, was killed. War was now only a matter of time. In this tense situation, the U.S. destroyer USS Beale detected the position of submarine B-59. The Americans wanted to force the submarine to surface to identify it and avoid a conflict. To do this, they decided to send a signal. They began using small, practice depth charges, which would not damage the submarine but would explode nearby, creating a sound to signal it to surface. But deep in the ocean, to the exhausted and frightened crew of B-59, these sounds did not seem like a practice or a drill. To them, it was a direct attack. They felt that the war had begun and the Americans were trying to sink them. In the submarine's control room were 3 key individuals. Valentin Savitsky, the submarine's captain, was an experienced but, at that moment, intensely stressed man. He was convinced that the war had started and his only duty was to retaliate and destroy the enemy. There was also Ivan Maslenikov, the ship's political officer. His job was to uphold party ideology and maintain crew morale. He too agreed with the captain. And then there was Vasili Arkhipov. He was not only the second in command of B-59, but also the commander of the entire submarine flotilla. His rank was equal to that of the captain. Captain Savitsky erupted in rage. He shouted, "We will blow them up now. We will die, but we will sink them too. We will not bring any shame to the Navy." He gave the order to launch the nuclear torpedo. The political officer, Maslenikov, also consented. But there was a catch. According to Soviet protocol, launching a nuclear torpedo required the unanimous approval of all 3 senior officers present in the control room. After the captain and the political officer said yes, only one person's consent remained, Vasili Arkhipov's. In that cramped, hot environment of the control room, the most crucial argument in world history began. Savitsky and Maslenikov were pushing to launch, but Arkhipov remained calm. He kept his cool even in this extreme moment. He argued that they had not received any orders from Moscow to attack. These explosions might be a signal from the Americans. He said that using a nuclear weapon without certain proof would be a terrible mistake that would destroy the entire world. His calm and firm stance somewhat de-escalated the heated situation. He was not just an officer, he had previously shown his bravery and cool-headedness during a fatal accident on another Soviet nuclear submarine. And thus, the crew held him in immense respect. After hours of breathtaking debate, Arkhipov remained steadfast in his decision. He would not, under any circumstances, authorize the use of the nuclear torpedo. His firm no ultimately forced Captain Savitsky to back down. They decided to take the risk of surfacing the submarine and attempting to contact Moscow. When B-59 surfaced, they saw the American fleet surrounding them, but no war was taking place. The Americans had not attacked them. They were only sending signals. The misunderstanding came to an end. The submarine turned around and began its journey back to Moscow without providing any information to the Americans. At the same time, intense diplomatic negotiations were taking place behind the scenes between Washington and Moscow. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized they were losing control of the situation. Finally, a compromise was reached. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba, and in return, America publicly promised not to invade Cuba. Additionally, America secretly agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, although this secret agreement was not revealed until many years later. On October 28th, the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end. The world never knew that day how close it had come to a horrifying disaster. The story of Vasili Arkhipov and B-59 remained shrouded in Soviet state secrecy for decades. No one knew that one man's decision had saved the world from a nuclear war. Upon their return to the Soviet Union, Captain Savitsky and his crew were not honored as heroes. On the contrary, an admiral told them, "It would have been better if you had gone down with your ship." They were reprimanded because they had failed to complete their mission. Vasili Arkhipov continued his career in the Navy. He became a vice admiral and was known as a highly respected officer, but he never spoke publicly about this incident. In 1998, he passed away quietly from cancer caused by radiation exposure. Years after his death, when the Soviet archives were opened, this incredible story first came to light. In 2002, at a conference marking the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, historians and even Kennedy's former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, acknowledged that Vasili Arkhipov's decision had saved the world that day. Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, said, "The man who saved the world was a man named Vasili Arkhipov." Today, we live in a world where the danger of nuclear weapons is as present as ever. But whenever we think of the horrors of nuclear war, we should also remember Vasili Arkhipov. We should remember that lone man who, sitting in the deep darkness of the ocean, under immense pressure, chose humanity. He never sought recognition as a hero, but his single "no" was one of the most powerful words in human history.